Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm chief economist here at American Compass. And today we are talking with the one and only Michael Lind. He is a bucket list guest here for the podcast, and he did not disappoint. You'll see he's written a compass point for us last week on So What If Tariffs Are Taxes, which I think was a really refreshing take on some of these debates that are starting to crop up about, are tariffs taxes anyway? Who do they fall on? Are they regressive or progressive? Really moves that discussion forward. But to be honest, we don't even get to that in our conversation. We're busy talking about so many other things: countervailing power, social insurance. Really a treat to get to talk with him. I think you'll enjoy it. Before we get to that, though, I have to tell you about everything else on the Commons this week. Yesterday, we had Kelvin and Anson Yu on why conservatives should turbocharge science investment. Today, Chris Griswold is talking about what it means for conservatives to actually go beyond symbolic outreach to labor and take seriously a commitment to worker power. He draws on his own experience in Japan there, which is a really interesting analog. And we'll also have Micah Meadowcroft on foreign affairs, and particularly as conservatives focus more on the balance of power in Asia, what that means in practice. Compass Point this week is a banger, as they say. Jonathan Berry of Boyd and Gray gave a terrific set of remarks at NatCon a few weeks ago on the corporation as a creation of the state that must be subservient to it. And we've adapted those here. I think it really flags a lot of interesting policy opportunities that conservatives have forgotten we have, seeing as corporations are something that government creates and is in fact obligated to regulate. And finally, I cannot move on to our conversation with Mike Lind until reminding you once again that if you have not subscribed to Understanding America, the best news Substack in the world, you can still do so. It is still free. I am writing twice weekly at understandingamerica.substack.com. And with that, here is Mr. Michael Lind. Michael Lind, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think I was going to start by saying, of course, all American podcast listeners know all about Michael Lind, but as our popularity continues to skyrocket, we are a big tent podcast, and we welcome people even who are not intimately familiar with you and your work. So we should start there. You have had a fascinating career. Give the short overview of what you've been up to, what you think about all the time.
Well, I've gone from ghostwriting a book for William F. Buckley Jr. to being invited to dinner with the White House with the Clintons to being canceled by the left recently when I published what is possibly the most pro collective bargaining book in decades, Hell to Pay. So I've been all over the map politically. I think I've been fairly consistent for the 30 years or so I've been involved in politics and journalism in the nonprofit sector, defending some of the themes we'll talk about today: economic nationalism, including industrial policy, a contributory social insurance system rather than pity charity welfare, and a realism in foreign policy. And at various times, this has put me on the left, the right, or the center. But I've pretty much stuck to my guns. The world keeps moving around.
No, I think that's right. You're almost the sort of quintessential marker by which you can measure what has happened in American politics over the past 3 or 4 decades, and where what I likewise would say is the sort of correct, common sense set of ideas has found itself at times in one party, at times in the other, and at times in no party at all. Um, hopefully it is refinding a home these days in America. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to start with some of those actual ideas. And I think the two that I would really highlight, but feel free to correct me or throw in others. When I think of your work, I think first about the idea of countervailing power, and secondly, this point about contributory social insurance. That certainly for myself, those are the two things that I have most learned and taken from your work. And so wanted to jump into those a little bit. Um, Countervailing power and your book, the class war, I think goes into this in most depth, is it is a somewhat unique way of understanding capitalism and democratic capitalism in particular. Um, make the case. What is countervailing power and why is it so important?
Well, there's actually an economic theory behind the structure that countervailing power tries to deal with. And I wrote about this with the economist Robert D. Atkinson in our book, Big is Beautiful. Basically, by the 1920s and 1930s, economists realized that in imperfect markets, there was a tendency towards natural monopoly or sometimes oligopoly. You've got giant corporations, sometimes you just got monopolistic companies. It came in two kinds. In manufacturing, you have increasing returns to scale. That's why there are a lot of little mom and pop aerospace companies or automobile companies. When it comes to things in the nature of grids, whether they are physical, like sanitation grids or electrical grids, or virtual, like search engines, there are network effects, which also lead towards oligopoly and monopoly. But what that meant was the whole idea of bargaining power between employers and workers, which existed to a certain extent if you had a blacksmith who was trying to compete for apprentices in a village with other blacksmiths. But a janitor does not have any kind of bargaining power as an isolated individual with a giant corporation. And one of the statistics we came across in our book, Big is Beautiful by Robert Atkinson and I, is that in the private sector, a slight majority of American private sector workers are employed by companies with more than 500 employees. Now, you would never know that from all the talk about small business, but we live in a world of large organizations and have for in much of the 20th century. Uh, these giant monopolistic and oligopolistic companies also have bargaining power with consumers, right? You know, they can jack up their prices and competition will not drive down what economists call rents, which is not referring to landlords, but it's referring to profits far in excess out of what they would be in a competitive market, thanks to market power. And so what set me on ultimately a collision course with the kind of libertarian free market right, and also with a lot of neoliberals was just, basic. It's not economics 101, it's economics 202. It's all of the stuff that you don't learn in elementary
Right. In
economics.
in economics 101, the you learn supply and demand, and there's an upward sloping supply curve. In economics 202, you learn there's often not an upward sloping supply curve. In fact, the more of something you make, the cheaper it gets to make more of it, and that changes industrial organization completely.
And it gets really weird. Then you have no equilibrium price whatsoever. Things are just set by bargaining power. So where does countervailing power come in? Well, there are two ways that you can respond to this unequal market power of, well, actually, there are three ways of these big corporations and big utilities. One is you can break them up, antitrust, but you're sacrificing efficiency when you do so. If the concentration has come about as a result of devious behavior, then by all means, antitrust, will break it up and you go back to a natural competitive market with lots of small producers. But breaking up, let's say a Ford Motor Company into 10 little small motor companies, you're just going to lose out in international competition. Among other things, you lose the benefits of scale. And unless you break up companies in the automobile sector every 10 years, they're just going to grow it together through merger. So that leaves you with two other alternatives: regulation and and bargaining. And regulation, just government regulation. The government sets the prices, and this can take the form of bargaining sometimes. For example, if you have public utility commissions, and they don't just pick these numbers out of the top of their head, they bargain with the utility companies and come up with something acceptable. In every democracy except for the United States, medical prices are set by such a process of utility style bargaining between doctors, hospitals, and pharma companies. and government commissions. And where the bargaining is successful with these utility commissions, the prices are set so they can make a moderate profit, not super profits, but essentially it's not an adversarial thing. The commissions want the industries to flourish, but they also want everyone to have electricity or everyone to have water, or everyone to be able to afford, diabetes medicine, insulin. Uh, so that's one approach as an alternative to antitrust regulation. And finally, the third, which is the least developed now after half a century of neoliberalism, is bargaining by consumers and by labor. And before I get into labor bargaining, we forget that consumers, by binding together in purchasing cooperatives, can bargain with producers to lower prices. And to some extent, this happens in our health insurance system, where the big health insurance companies do engage in bargaining for discounts, pharma companies, for example, or with the producers. So, but the main form of bargaining that is essential to having a large middle class in an industrial society dominated by monopolies and oligopolies is collective bargaining. That is between the representatives of workers in large groups and their employers, either single employers or all of the employers in a single occupation or industry, in what's called sectoral bargaining. Now, to my mind, should not be controversial, right? This is just, it flows from the nature of imperfect markets and the tendencies towards industrial concentration, and it allows you to get the benefits of industrial concentration without the downside of having basically all power to set wages on one side, on the employer side. But curiously enough, there's a lot of money and wealth involved, as you would gather, and it's a dispute not about production, but about the distribution of profit. So the smart non-communist, non-revolutionary unionists have always said, we want the companies we work for to succeed. We want industry to flourish. That's more money for everybody. What we want is not only for the industry to make more money, but uh, for us to have a bigger relative share of the profits. We want the investors, the capitalists who invest in the company to get high returns. We want the managers to be paid well, but we just think that the workers should be paid somewhat more. And the political scientist Jacob Hacker has popularized the term pre-distribution for this profit sharing, this pre-tax profit sharing. I think it's a bit confusing because when you say it, it sounds like redistribution. So it's kind of hard. And grammatically, it's really distribution.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. And so during the New Deal era, and actually before the New Deal era, because going back to the 1890s, you had presidents like William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. They were not anti-labor by any means. They wanted kind of the government to broker deals to avert disastrous strikes in mines and railroads and so on with employers. But it's only so the New Deal built on a kind of prehistory of government support for what is sometimes called tripartism. That is, government brokering deals between business and labor, particularly in concentrated industries. One of the major pieces of labor legislation, the Railway Labor Act, was passed by Calvin Coolidge. He was thought of as a libertarian, although he's a protectionist and in favor of collective
Yeah.
bargaining.
So I think what's so interesting is the way you've sort of presented these as kind of alternative, like you sort of have to choose one. And what's striking about the kind of the neoliberal or market fundamentalist model that we've been operating in for a while is there's this idea that because markets are going to function so well, you don't have to choose any of them. You can just go with the market outcome. And for me, and the argument that we always make at American Compass about labor in particular is to say that's just not a stable equilibrium. And in fact, even in the neoliberal era, everybody kind of admitted it wasn't. And the default everybody went to was the redistribution, right? It was this idea that we're going to grow the economic pie without reference to who participates how. And then, oh, that's going to be really unjust in all sorts of ways, but that's okay. We can mail checks to to whoever we have to mail checks to. And of course, conservatives and libertarians don't like that either. Some libertarians do. The sort of universal basic income libertarians see that as much less invasive, and they can be, left alone to drop their acid and trade their cryptocurrency and so forth. But by and large, for conservatives, it seems to me it would be much better to actually have this countervailing power that you're describing, to have private actors pursuing their own interests be in position to do that effectively, both at the labor market level as workers and then in the workplace, uh, at, as opposed to needing kind of thousands of pages of labor regulations. Um, and I guess I'm curious, to what extent do you think that ever was the case? Are we just being nostalgic to say this ever worked, or did it in fact work at one time?
No, I think it did work, and it worked in the 19th century and in the Gilded Age and in the New Deal. Libertarians in Washington like to say, we're not pro business, we're pro market. Well, I would invert that. For most of American history, both parties have been pro business, not pro market. And I would even say they've been pro enterprise rather than pro market. So they start with the analysis that something needs to be done. Okay. There needs to be an enterprise to undertake this. And then the next step is, should it be direct public provision? Should it be a government chartered corporation? Should it be a price and entry utility system in which companies have to be regulated according to certain standards in order to operate in the market? Or should it just be laissez-faire? And so, so I think the idea of free market determining everything neglects the fact that there are all these alternative ways of providing the objectives you want. And historically, conservatives, I don't know what the term means in the US at this point, but certainly in Europe and Asia, have not been free market libertarians. Libertarians in the 19th century were called anarchists. And then they began calling themselves liberals to distinguish themselves from social democrats and progressives. Uh, but the term libertarian goes back to 1950s, basically. But they are basically anarchists. And I preface this by saying some of my best friends are libertarians, but it's essentially it's what I call market utopianism. It's a religion, and for the true believers in this market utopian religion, power does not exist. There's no power in the universe. The only kinds of power that exist are coercive police power. It's the police and the army and jail and locking you up if you don't pay taxes. There's no other power in society of any kind. There's no market power within economies. There's no relative power in the economy among commercial leaders and commercial dependents in the global economy. So it's a utopian system going back to the physiocrats in the 18th century, if not earlier. The idea is if you just get rid of government, nothing will happen bad. Everything that's good will continue, and all the bad stuff will wither away. Right. So it's a radically utopian, otherworldly doctrine. And if conservatism means being guided by facts and reality and human nature and the nature of things, then it really has nothing to do with classical conservatism at all.
Yeah. And of course it should be added that a large number of these libertarians tend to work in the nonprofit sector where they have no marginal revenue product that can determine their appropriate wage, and yet somehow their salaries all get set at quite reasonable levels from what I understand.
Well,
So
it's a gift.
something must be going on.
It's a gift economy.
That's
And of course, libertarianism is selective. So there have been a few dissident libertarians who say, well, for us true free market libertarians, you can't have patent protections, right? Because government patents are government monopolies and the government prosecutes you. But why should it prosecute you for using a chemical compound? The fact that you discovered it doesn't matter. It's part of the laws of nature, right? And why should they put you in jail? Because this other person found it first. And also limited liability laws, which have only existed for private companies since the middle of the 19th century. Uh, Without limited liability laws, I love limited liability laws. I'm in favor of patents. I love industrial capitalism properly organized. You wouldn't have large corporations because you would have partnerships, and the partners would be so afraid of being sued as individuals and being bankrupted by lawsuit, which investors in limited liability corporations are not, that they would be, you wouldn't have innovation, right? People would not be willing, to invest in things which could fail without them personally being liable for the debts of the company.
Right.
But but so libertarians, well, we're for free markets, except the government should send you to prison if you violate a patent that is a government granted monopoly, and except for the fact that if a corporation's negligence kills your kid, you should be able to sue until the company is bankrupt, but you shouldn't be able to go after the personal assets of the managers and the shareholders. Apart from that, we're for free markets, right?
Yes, it's not entirely consistent, I think, to say the least. All right, so this is countervailing power. There's obviously then an entire discussion to be had on the policy side of what one does if one believes that countervailing power is good and important. We will gloss completely over that and refer people instead to your corpus of fine writing, including at American Compass, on the topic. But I want to get to this other idea also, which is it is distinct and yet complementary in various ways, I think, of social insurance and the role of the state in essentially providing some benefits as as very distinct from what people complain about as welfare. And this is one of my favorite pieces we've ever published at American Compass was your essay, "The Government Should Keep Its Hands Off Your Medicare," which I think did a very good job distinguishing Social Security and Medicare from the traditional safety net. And it's funny because in our politics, in fact, everyone does seem to understand that these things are distinct. And yet, within the conservative movement, from the perspective of economists, they sort of shouldn't be. So elaborate on that. What is going on here in your mind?
Well, what's going on there to some degree, to be a cool kid among the economists or among the economic commentators, you have to say most people believe this, but counterintuitively, it's actually the opposite. And again on issues from trade to social insurance to wages to immigration, it turns out the common sense is actually correct, and the counterintuitive elite view is wrong. Uh,
It's hard to get tenure with that point of view, Mike. That's not going to work.
well, that's right. Uh, yeah, as far as I can tell, in every democracy, in Europe and North America, everywhere, ordinary people distinguish between social insurance benefits like Social Security and Medicare, which are universal government benefits. And usually they are paid for by contributory taxes of some sort, like payroll taxes, or it's called a contribution to say that you earned it. And this is distinguished from what pejoratively in America is known as welfare, right? So for the average high school educated working class American who does not, think about these things very much, Social Security is not welfare. Food stamps are. Universal programs that you have to have some work effort to receive, some work record in the past, you or some member of your family, those are different in kind from government mediated charity that is means tested. And this goes into a larger discussion about the philosophy of democratic republicanism, which underpins what in my most recent American Compass piece I call the Jacksonian philosophy. Andrew Jackson was not terribly intellectual, but there were Jacksonian intellectuals. I mean, there were a lot of smart people. And they claimed, a lot correctly to some extent, in my view, to be following the consequences of democratic republicanism. And the basis of democratic republicanism, as they defined it, was suspicion of power. So unlike the libertarians, they did not simply banish power from the universe. They thought power was real. It needed to be wielded for various public purposes, not just the military, but there needed to be checks and balances. And those in the Jacksonian populist tradition, who were largely agrarians in the 19th century, and the labor left, the non-Marxist labor left in the 20th, a lot of them really Jacksonians. They're very suspicious of granting enormous discretionary policy power to member to Congress as a whole, or to federal agencies or state and local agencies. And this goes completely against the conventional wisdom shared by both right neoliberals and left neoliberals that universal programs are inefficient. Uh, like Social Security, we better took the same amount of money and means tested it, and then the neediest people would get more, and then the people who don't need it wouldn't get any. And the Jacksonian populist Democratic Republican answer to that is, well, yes, in theory, that's correct, but who will make the decision of who gets what? Your premise is, they would say, that there's this body of experts who are altruistic and they're not corruptible, and they can decide who gets what on the basis of objective need. And the Jacksonians they weren't paranoid about government. They're just skeptical about government. They thought if you set up a system with large amounts of discretion on the part of policymakers, it will inevitably be abused, right? It will be captured by lobbies and it will turn into a political patronage system. And you saw this in the debate in the 1890s and 1900s between populists and progressives. The progressives tended to be upper middle class, college educated, reformers with civic minded people. And they thought, well, we need to get policy away from corrupt legislatures and given to this altruistic class of civil servants or city managers or some nonpartisan figures like that who would make good decisions in the public interest, informed by social science. The agrarian populists, the William Jennings Bryan populists, did not believe that such people exist. They saw legislative corruption by lobbies as being a perennial problem. They didn't deny it, but they had several solutions to this. One solution was extremely detailed legislation. Now, this is not necessarily the most successful, having a 5,000, but the point of the detail was to minimize discretion. The more plausible solutions were having public policies that were universal rather than having the character of what Jacksonians pejoratively called class legislation, right? So they did not want the government to say, well, we're going to have two classes of people, the middle class and the needy. And the needy will get this and the middle class will get that. Because who's going to draw the line, right? And today, I think this underlies the kind of populist revulsion among, you find this in people of all races against this post 1970s racial classification system and different benefits depending on how you're classified as an AAPI, Asian and Pacific Islander, or now a MENA, Middle East North African. This is the new census category. And if you're classified as a non-Hispanic white, you get fewer benefits and eligibility for affirmative action set aside than if you're a Middle East North African, right? And so those are two examples, one economic, one based on ethnicity of class legislation. And another example I talked about in my Peace for American Compass on tariffs and taxes is hypothecated legislation or hypothecated earmarked taxation. Sometimes it's called earmarked taxes. So it's very popular among voters everywhere in the country. So you have a cigarette tax. You tax a vice, and then it can only be used to build public schools. Say. Economists hate this because it goes, the economists, they claim to be objective. If they were really objective, they would just say there are costs and benefits to this, do whatever you want. but they're not, they really have a secular religion of their own. It's not libertarianism. It's a Benthamite utilitarianism. Is very close to the progressive, early 20th century progressive view. It is, you have enlightened experts and you want to maximize their discretion.
Right. Well, I
So
was going to
they
say it's very specifically that it is an ideology that coincidentally concludes that it is economists who have the special knowledge that indeed needs to shape all of these decisions.
Right, and so they've come up with, just to go on a diversion a little bit, with things like market failures. And only the PhD economist knows when there's a market failure that requires government action or not, right? And you have to pay an economist who won't do anything, right? Who will tell you it's a market failure. And then if you don't want to do it, another economist is paid to say it's not a market failure. All a market failure means is that you want to do something, right? So if you want to have rural electrification in the 1920s, you don't have to prove there's a market failure. You just want all the farm households to have electricity. It's right. It's simple. You don't need to pay any economists.
No, that's exactly right. It's funny, when I published the Once and Future Worker, it very intentionally spoke in neoliberal economic terms to make an argument to these people, in effect, that even within your own framework, this sort of obsession with efficiency and maximizing consumption and so far was incorrect because there are, for instance, positive externalities to good jobs. And so it was a somewhat tongue-in-cheek use of the market failure framework. When people would say like, oh, so like, how are you defining this market failure? I would say, like, to be clear, I think using market failure as the way to understand this is ludicrous. It's a parlor game, but it is striking how much more seriously in certain circles a critique or a policy proposal becomes even a tariff, right? If you say, oh, well, technically this tariff is a response to this innovation economy related market failure and it's an efficient Pigovian response. And people go like, huh, let's pencil that out. Whereas if you say, making things really matters and we need to protect the domestic market, that's populist nonsense.
Well, before it was populist nonsense, it was institutionalist economics.
Hmm.
So there was, that's what it was called in the early 20th century. And the institutionalists viewed economics as basically a cross between journalism and history. So if you wanted to know, like, what the options were in electrifying rural America, you did empirical quasi-journalistic work. You saw what they did in Denmark and you saw what they did in France. You saw what they did in the UK, and then maybe you would apply this here, right? There wasn't a whole lot of algebra involved.
Yeah.
And then you had historical economics.
That's really interesting. I just we were just having a discussion. American Compass was hosting a dinner on this topic, and this issue came up of in a debate over tariffs. What do you do when all the economic models, which are programmed by definition to say that tariffs are bad, produce a response that says tariffs are bad? And one view is, well, you should build a counter, a countervailing model, if you will, that uses a different set of assumptions that says tariffs are good. And my view was you can do that. You probably have to, given how our politics operates today. But as a matter of good policymaking, it is an almost farcical exercise. Whereas what I find much more interesting and useful is, for instance, the work that American Compass does on case studies. So we published a whole set of case studies looking at, here is how the Japanese auto quota led to the development of a foreign auto industry in the United States. Here is how our small business investment program led to innovation. Here is how Airbus beat Boeing, and that it doesn't in today's political economy get the same respect as some model that nobody understands, but it probably is a much more useful form of research to guide policymakers in a lot of cases.
Well, look, Cicero, the Roman statesman and philosopher, wrote that he did not understand how two Roman soothsayers could pass each other in the street without bursting into laughter. I think this is kind of my view of the people making these models. For 30 years, I was involved in off and on the nonprofit think tank sector in Washington, well, for 20 years, and then in policy journalism. I did not attend a single discussion in any organization of a public policy challenge for the US in which someone said, well, before we talk about this, why don't we see what the other 34 or 35 members of the OECD are doing, right? Or have done already, with some exceptions. When I raised that point, and people thought it was like you were speaking Esperanto or something, and they quickly moved on to the idea this is a completely unprecedented challenge. There are dozens and dozens of industrial democracies now, in mostly in Europe and Asia, but elsewhere in the world. They face the same problems. They have retirement plans. They have the social insurance systems. They have means tested welfare. They have health care pricing systems. So unless you have gone through the OECD handbook and said, let's look at what Singapore does, let's look at what Switzerland does, then you're just engaged in this kind of game like in high school algebra where you're proving that zero equals zero. And it's a form of lobbying, because depending on who's paying for the exercise, you will come up with different conclusions.
Yeah, that's right. One of my favorite papers is it's an OECD study on education, and it came out in 2010, and it's looking at the different vocational training systems in different countries. And there's a wonderful chart that shows what share of students in each country goes onto a vocational track in high school versus a university track. Sort of ranges mostly from 40 to 70%. And then there's a footnote at the bottom that says the US has been excluded from this chart because our system is too different. And I always thought that was very funny. The whole point of the chart is to show the difference in the systems. And totally coincidentally, I happened to be in a meeting with the main author of the study. I asked him about this. He said, "Oh yeah, we actually had the US on the chart and it was like 2%." And people said like, "No, that's like people will get too angry if they see that. We can't have that on the chart. So we'll put a note in instead." But you're exactly right on all of these issues. And I think it's especially a problem on the right of center where there is both. I think there's a very healthy American exceptionalism in some respects that becomes a very unhealthy provincialism when it goes too far, combined with this idea that, oh, well, Europe is a bunch of socialist countries. So if you look at what's going on somewhere else, that's what the left wants. And that's just not true. There are things in Europe that look more like what the Democratic Party might support, and there are things in Europe that look a lot more like just traditionally what the Republican Party would support anyway, and certainly what a Republican Party committed to the interests of working families would want to learn from and take seriously.
Well, and they don't have to be democracies necessarily, because all modern industrial countries face similar, you can study the Chinese communist dictatorial ethic light system without, endorsing Marxist, Leninist, Maoist Xi Jinping thought, right?
Be
Uh,
careful. I've been so bold as to suggest that we should raise enough tax revenue to cover the spending that we do in this country, and that apparently makes me a socialist already. So you got to
like
tread
a
carefully.
Hungarian or Cuban communist or something. So, yeah, well, at this point, I spend much of my career in coming up with counter arguments against libertarians and neoliberals and so on. Uh, because you have to do it to some extent. The politicians want it, right? So they can make the points with their donors, among other things. But at the end of the day, it's a form of lobby. I mean, it's unreal. It's like a campaign rhetoric, and so I think there has to be somewhat of a division of labor. And it's very difficult, as I don't have to tell you, in the think tank world and in the policy research world, to be trying to change the climate rather than the weather. That's my metaphor. To change the climate is to change the next election or to get something passed in 2026. To change the weather is to change. I'm sorry, to change that's changing the weather. I've
Right.
got it backwards. There's the short term weather, there's the long term climate. The long term climate is the long term intellectual climate. And that's going to take 25, 50, 75, 100 years, whatever it takes. And there's a difference between the short term seeding the clouds, right, to make it rain when it wouldn't rain otherwise. That's intellectual, political weather making. as opposed to intellectual climate change, where you just pump out your ideas like greenhouse gases into the intellectual atmosphere until it becomes absorbed and into the environment. And that's what happened with all of these libertarian, liberal, neoliberal ideas. They were marginal in the 40s and 50s and even the 60s. They had an apparatus behind them. Think takes like Cato and Reason Magazine and so on. Now, it helped that it served certain interests. So there's always that challenge with ideas. But with some of the bigger challenges we face, I'm not a total cynic. For example, with regard to our economic interactions with China, there's pretty much a consensus, I think, among policymakers in both parties now that you can't just treat China as you're going to take a blind eye to their mercantilism, and it's driven by national security. It's not driven by any affection for the left behind people in the Midwest, except in a few cases. But that's an example of intellectual climate change. The way Biden has followed Trump. With the tariffs on China. So sometimes events themselves will force policymakers to change, and the events and the logic of events can override the power of lobbies.
Yeah, that is a perfect description, of course, of what we try to at American Compass, and maybe to some extent why I so resist the description think tank, even though there is no other description, I guess, for what we are. Um, because we're very interested in the weather, and I think doing the work on the weather ultimately is what creates the material to have the climate discussion. I'm hopelessly mixing the metaphor already, but at the end of the day, it is that climate that has to change. It's, in our mission statement, we refer to it as the economic consensus. And I guess I'm certainly optimistic from a time frame perspective that it is something that happens on the 10 to 20-year cycle rather than in the 75 to 100-year cycle. And at least from my perspective, it it is happening. I think the trade is obviously a quintessential example, and I think it has been forced by the China issue. But I think in general, certainly my read, and I think we see this in our politics, is there is a much greater understanding, at least that the neoliberal framework has not been up to the task and has caused a lot of problems, even if there is no agreement on what comes next. I guess we'll get to virtually none of the things I listed on at the start. This will have to be part one of a series, maybe a trilogy, in the coming months. But let me just at least briefly get to the current politics. I'm curious what you make of things in the U.S. system at the moment. Do you think it is right to be optimistic? You have a J.D. Vance on a presidential ticket. You have a Teamsters president speaking at the Republican National Convention. Or are you one of at best tempered optimism?
Well, there's always things improving and others going downhill rapidly. So I do think we're at a revolutionary period, a period of big change, as my old boss at the State Department, Michael Vlaus, used to say. And I do think we're getting close to saying neoliberalism as the dominant paradigm from the 1970s or 80s up until the Great Recession. I do think that's being replaced. It's certainly being replaced by the more populist nationalists, right? And by post liberals, whatever you want to call it, and you and your colleagues. Uh, that doesn't mean that the incumbents don't have power, and
Right.
the incumbents can win some battles, but there's no life to it, right? It's kind of like Brezhnev Soviet communism. It's people go through the motions, but young people, there's nothing inspirational there. And on the left, I think there is a new, and to my mind, dangerous alternative to neoliberalism. There are things worse than neoliberalism, which is this kind of technocratic progressivism, which drops any attempt to be neoliberal, to have rules. It's kind of a throwback to the more authoritarian versions of progressivism in the 1900s, right? When you would have uh, Philip Drew administrator. He was the hero of a science fiction novel published anonymously by Colonel Edwin Mandel House of Texas, who was Woodrow Wilson's advisor. But Philip Drew is a West Point graduate who comes to power, defeats the robber barons, creates a Cromwellian military dictatorship, and imposes Social Security. So I do think what we're seeing with on the center left is this kind of, it's not Marxist, it's not socialist by any means. They're not terribly quantitative. Certainly their Silicon Valley and Hollywood backers are not. But it's this idea that everything is open to technocratic engineering from the center, right? That's the basis of equity or DEI. We will redistribute outcomes in everything, economic outcomes, racial disparities, everything. And we will basically use the power of the federal government if the states and cities don't do it. And if the Congress fails, then El Presidente will do it, right? We will have
Yeah.
a presidential Caesarist regime.
And Kamala Harris is such a fascinating leader of this in a sense. I mean, she back in 2020 was sort of somewhat ridiculed for having these policy proposals like forgive student loans of people who start small businesses in underserved communities for at least 3 years, right? There's actually we'll put it in the show notes. There's a little online random generator of Kamala Harris proposals that sort of, inserts policy mechanism, inserts protected group, inserts purpose. And so, you can get your, you know, new refundable tax credit for childcare providers of immigrant, heavy communities. And like you can do that endlessly. And that is certainly the mode of policy making that seems to be ascendant on parts of the left of center. And to your point, it raises that set of concerns that the Jacksonians had, that even if on a whiteboard you can claim that this is in fact an incredibly effective and efficient allocation of resources, it just runs afoul of everything everybody knows to be true about what government actually can and can't do.
Well, I think Barack Obama promised he would create a new foundation for the American polity, and then people laughed and they forgot about the phrase. But I do think that the Obama administration was kind of representative of this nascent technocratic progressivism. And like the Obamacare market, if you've looked at one of these websites, I have multiple graduate degrees and have taught at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and the University of Texas. I find it baffling, right? And all the options and the silver plan and the bronze plan and all of that. Uh, but it creates an entire category of people, Sherpas. You remember the Sherpas from Obamacare, named after the native guides on Mount Everest? That since you look at the website for a while, you give up, and then you go to the nonprofit or government intermediary who explains exactly what point of this overly complicated mechanism you need. And in a weird way, this is kind of a regression to the way government works in badly governed countries where you need fixers, right? Where it's just hopeless to go through the courts because they're corrupt or the law is baffling or whatever. So you need to pay somebody who knows somebody who can pay somebody to get whatever you need, your driver's license or your prescription filled or whatever. So it's not socialism. It's not Marxism, Leninism. I mean, that was simplifying things, if anything. But it's this weird combination of bureaucratic social engineering of society with kind of neoliberalism on steroids, where everything is sort of in market, but it's sort of managed, and it's the whole thing just then becomes Byzantine. And the only people who can negotiate it are people who are connected to the power structure.
Well, on that uplifting note, we must conclude. I will simply plug your essay, which everyone should go read. I think it is, as I was telling you before we started, I've had 2 or 3 conversations and just this week where I've said, well, you have to go read what Mike just wrote about this because it's so relevant to what everyone is debating right now. The title is So What If Tariffs Are Taxes? maybe we will talk about it more when we undoubtedly have to have you back
Mhm.
soon. Mike Lynn, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks, Oren, and keep changing the intellectual climate.
We will do our best, and maybe we will discuss it on the next episode of the American Compass podcast.